Hello and welcome to this video on how you can smell. That is, all the good, bad, pleasant, unpleasant, and all other scents and odors. The human ability to smell things may be seen as inferior to many other species, such as dogs, but that should not detract from the amazing nature of how it is that we can detect these small particles that are what give rise to odors. Understand that to get commensurate functionality, we need highly specialized, highly technical, and incredibly temperamental machinery that is maintained in pristine conditions in very controlled environments in a laboratory. The human nose, on the other hand, can, by working with the brain, link these tiny and often only present in minuscule amounts molecules with the right identity and be called on again at the next exposure just about every time. The first thing you need for this is obviously some sort of stimulant. It could be something like vanillin, which is what gives us vanilla flavor. No matter what it is, the molecule responsible will make its way up your nose. At the top of your nose is the nasal cavity. This is where you'll find the olfactory bulb. It is a bundle of neurons directly connected to your brain. There are two parts to this. You have the main olfactory bulb, and this connects to the amygdala, and it also has another pathway through there. For the most part, from the amygdala you need to be worried about the olfactory cortex as well, and these work together as your primary pathway. The secondary pathway goes through the accessory olfactory bulb, and this sits on the dorsal posterior part of the main olfactory bulb. For the most part, it is a parallel pathway, and so for the purposes of this video, we will assume that any stimuli that activates one of these will be activating the other, and therefore passing through both pathways. The neurons involved in the olfactory bulb are somewhat special. They have a very specific receptor on the surface. It is specific to just one molecule. It can be a little flexible, but it's kind of like a cheap padlock. A random key might work, but it is best to use the right key, because it works every time and you get the best and strongest response, and you get your padlock to work properly every time. The bulb itself is found at the top of the nasal cavity. From here you have finger-like projections hanging out, called dendrites. This is where you'll find those specific receptors that catch the odorants or molecules. Odorants, however, do not necessarily directly interact with the bulb in all cases. Most often they are dissolved in some sort of mucus layer first. This makes it easier for them to bind to the receptor and ensures that they aren't inundated with everything that goes into your nose. If this wasn't there, the olfactory bulb would be constantly covered by dust, dirt, and other grime that's not caught out by the rest of your nose trying to filter these things away. This is why the mucus sits over the olfactory epithelium, which is what is making the mucus, and also over the olfactory bulb itself. Because of this, you need those dendrites with the olfactory hairs, or those finger-like projections, with those receptors poking out. Collectively, it ensures you can have them work without being inundated by more stimulus than can be handled effectively. When you do finally get a stimulant binding to the receptor, the stimulation of it sends a signal along the dendrite's axon to the body of the neuron. This then goes out via another axon to the first step along the way, and this is how you can begin to know what it is you are smelling. The inbound signal is always going to come from the olfactory epithelium, and that's the activation of that specific receptor. The outbound signal travels via mitral cell axons, and these then travel to the rest of your brain. The processing of these signals is rather like a circuit. The sense of smell can influence the brain by sending stimulus and signals, and in turn, the brain can influence the way your nose smells things by changing certain behaviors, narrowing the nostrils, changing the pulsing of the neurons, and more. All of these work together to ensure that your brain is not overloaded by information, but also that your brain and nose can continue working together. Once you get to the brain itself, so you have that signal traveling along the olfactory bulb, you come to the primary olfactory cortex. This is part of your cerebral cortex, so it's part of your processing part of the brain. It's on the lower part of the temporal lobe of the brain, or the inferior part. It must receive input from the olfactory bulb, or the olfactory tract to be specific. That bit of the olfactory bulb that travels into the brain. This is what proceeds to further process your sense of smell. It's important that you have this area working, because if you don't have this working, you can't associate smell or do anything more than know that something is stimulating your nose. From here, you need to look at the two locations it can possibly go to other than the part of the temporal lobe. It can go to the amygdala or the orbitofrontal cortex of the hippocampus. The amygdala and that part of the hippocampus have different roles to play, but they're generally summarized as emotion, memory, and learning. These are things that you may or may not have immediately thought of when thinking of smell. For example, certain smells can bring up emotions or memories. Some smells can be associated with certain learned behaviors. Because you have a link between the hippocampus and other parts of the brain, you are able to create these connections, and it means that you are able to know that a smell you've been exposed to before is the same thing as last time, and that whatever odor it is, such as dirty socks, apple pie, or pedicore, is exactly that. You know from past exposure. These linkages are one of the reasons why it is so important to have this part of the brain working the way it is. Then you have the amygdala, and particularly the amygdala, we're thinking of associations. That is, this odor is related to this thing or this behavior. By having certain odors or stimulants reinforce or deter certain associations, your brain is able to develop those or suppress them in some cases. And this is important for learning. In fact, if your brain doesn't learn to associate, you will basically never have any way to be able to remember what a particular smell is. The hippocampus is slightly different in that it's memory and learning. Primarily, we're thinking here about the way that the brain retains that memory and then allows it to work in association with the amygdala to coordinate the retention of the memory and the activating of that memory by a particular stimulus. Because these parts of the brain, along with the temporal lobe, are strongly associated with memories and linkages between these memories and other things, it is why your sense of smell can bring back emotions and memories very strongly. Things from your childhood can be stimulated and brought to the fore of your mind by a smell that you haven't encountered in a long time. We've mentioned how your brain can also have feedback on your ability to smell. There are two major ways for this to happen. The first and simplest of these, to a certain extent, is that by moderating the rate at which neurons fire or send off signals to the brain itself, you can then alter how the body effectively understands smell. For example, if you breathe in deeply, you breathe in slowly, but you breathe in a lot of air, which brings in a lot of stimulus. You can have a short period where you have rapid firing of the neurons in the olfactory bulb. Or you could suddenly snort or breathe in air sharply. This would also require fast firing of the olfactory bulb. Whereas if you're breathing normally, you don't want that. You want normal activity levels. This sort of activity is also important when we're talking about isolating a particular smell. To draw a comparison, you have something like gas chromatography, in which you have a very large, very complicated machine able to break up smells into individual peaks. Your body does something very similar, but that's by changing the way the olfactory bulb reacts and engages with what's happening. It creates the ability to filter out background smell or smells that you aren't trying to isolate, and therefore you can be more sensitive to particular odors. This is one way dogs, for instance, can be trained to be responsive to drugs. In humans, it's more a conscious action. You're trying to be sensitive to a particular odor, or find a particular smell. There are other kinds of receptors in the nasal cavity as well, and these will play a role in your sense of smell, although they're not actually related to smell exactly. These are more like a sense of pain. So for example, if you have a really acrid or nasty smelling chemical, this may actually give you a sense of pain. And one of the reasons why this happens is that you have particular nerve fibers called trigeminal nerve fibers in the olfactory epithelium. These react to these particular kinds of chemicals, and by doing so, they tell you, this is a bad thing, you shouldn't be interacting with it or near it, it's causing you pain. This sort of activity is important when we're looking at environmental hazards versus simply looking at odors themselves. The complexity, not only of the ability to differentiate between smell and environmental stimulus telling you that something is dangerous, is one of the bigger complications, but it's simply the fact that you have two very different structures doing two very different jobs. It's once you start looking at the olfactory bulb and its interactions with the rest of the brain that it begins to become really complicated. Not only can you smell what is going on around you, but remember it for the future. It's why some smells will trigger memories from long ago. How it is you can identify one smell from many, and how it is your brain, through the ability to apply your cortex and therefore use it as a processing mechanism. Smell is more complicated than just a lock and key model, but that is the first hurdle, and from there it just gets more difficult to understand. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.